Risk is what's left when you think you've thought of everything. I stopped making as many mistakes when I put myself in rooms around other people who...
If I just started this 20 to 25 years ago, I would be in such a different place right now if I just kept at it. There's a lot of people that start following advice on YouTube. And there's a lot of really, I don't want to call it bad advice, but it's just not good advice for people that are starting out. People just get excited because they're watching these like shiny objects on social media. And they assume like, oh, that's the thing, I can go mimic that. And it's just not a good way to do it.
Welcome back to the Hybrid Real Estate Professional Podcast, the podcast where we help you grow your own portfolio of cash flowing rentals that you can manage in only 20 minutes a day from anywhere in the country. Today, I have a special episode that I recorded in an X space with my friend Martin Beechin. We talked about our advice to investors who are looking to start out, and we gave both of our experience and some of the best steps that we think investors can take if they're looking to buy their first rental. Without further ado, let's get into it.
I'll start by asking you the first question. Like, how did you get started in real estate? Take me through the story.
Sure thing. Well, thanks for setting this up. Yeah, my name is Aaron Amin. I live in Houston, Texas. I'm a father of 3 kids under the age of 3. And by day, I work as a management consultant, a full-time 9-to-5 job. And by night, my wife and I have built a portfolio of 8 single-family rental properties across 3 states. Our closest rental is 1,000 miles away in an area called the Quad Cities in Iowa. And our furthest is in Washington State in central Washington. We also have 3 in Las Vegas. So we started as local investors when we were living in Las Vegas.
You're doing that across all those states.
Yep. Yeah.
That's wild.
It started organically as kind of investing in our backyard when we lived in Las Vegas. And as we moved across the country a couple times, we kept the houses that we had bought. So we became long distance investors kind of organically. And now that's our whole shtick.
Oh, that makes a little more sense. So you kind of just picked them up as you were living in a given area, and that's why they're so spread out.
Yeah, that's part of the story. So we never lived in Iowa, but I grew up in Washington State, and we lived in Las Vegas for 5 years. And that was where we started investing, was in Las Vegas. And then when we moved to Washington, we held all 4 properties in Las Vegas. And then when we moved to Texas, we held the 2 that we picked up in Washington. So it was definitely part of the story.
That's pretty crazy. And so you said you're up to 8 now?
Yes, across 3 states.
Wow. That's more than enough to keep you busy, especially if you're working full time, and 3 kids under 3. That's nuts. I can just feel my stress level rising thinking about that.
Yeah, definitely. It takes a toll on your sleep, that's for sure. And you gotta fight to keep your physical health in line too, with all those different balls in the air.
But, oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, like keeping your head like keeping your mental health in place, and also your physical health is huge. It's like so important.
Yeah.
Especially if you just get into those kind of dark periods where like it's just like that month where everything goes wrong.
Yeah, definitely.
Suddenly it ends up being a lot more important.
Yeah.
No, for sure. I understand.
Well, give us a quick background on yourself as well.
Yeah, no, for sure. So my name is Martin Beechin. I split my time between Eastern Washington and like the Phoenix area. Phoenix is kind of a newer thing for us. So we were primarily up in Washington before, but I'm trying to do more and more business down here. So we have a place down here, and we kind of like come down here for the warmer weather in the winter. Didn't historically do a lot with real estate, but been investing since the 90s. I had a huge exit event in 2021 for like a long-term investment. And then, so I was sitting on a lot of liquidity. And so it's just initially for me, it was, we'd always kind of toyed with the idea of like, hey, maybe we should have a rental. We had friends that were doing it. And so we started with 2 single family homes just because that was pretty easy to do. It was easy to get financing, especially at that time too. And we understood single family. So we figured worst case scenario, we can just sell them later. And the more we got into it, the more we liked it. And so that was 2021. Coming out of that, 2022 was kind of a weird year. The market kind of went crazy in the middle of it. It was really difficult to find deals. And we actually closed one of those single family homes in early 2021. But after we got kind of the hang of things, you saw what it was like doing that for, 6 to 12 months. Then we decided to expand much more heavily into it. So going into 2023, we bought 12 doors that year. So it was 3 duplexes and a 6-plex. And then kind of coming out of that, it took a long time to get all of that stuff settled. That was like a pretty big on ramp. Like I said, we had a lot of liquidity, so it was a lot easier to get into the deals and do stuff like that. But that was also in Eastern Washington when prices had finally kind of started to chill out a little bit after they started increasing rates. In 2022, things went nuts in Washington, kind of like they did everywhere, but it was especially in the eastern half of the state. It was really difficult to find anything. So
Yeah,
we
that's
kind of went on a buying spree once things loosened up in 2023. And then going into 2024, I would say we spent most of this last year kind of getting that stabilized and then buying 3 more doors. So I'm up to 18 doors currently, and that's across 7 properties. And then just
nice.
like kind of along the way doing a little bit of like flipping. And then, it's like there were some lots that we bought that we've made a pretty good return on that we targeted early on and just figured, hey, like it's hard to imagine us ever like selling this for less than we're getting it now. And yeah, so it's just been like the last few years in particular, it's been kind of a grind getting a lot of things figured out. We went to it like with no idea like kind of what we were doing. So like the last 2 years, it's just been a big kind of on ramp for us. So like no one in either of our families was doing like rentals. Like we had a couple friends that did it kind of lightly. At the time when we would go talk to them and try to get advice, they in our mind they were just like absolute pros. And now looking back, we said, man, these people had no idea what they were doing. They had like 3, 4 doors or something. But in my mind, I was like, man, I can't imagine having 4 properties. That just seemed like so much responsibility. But now it's a lot different.
It's
Yeah.
amazing.
I mean, that was for me. I don't know are you still expanding heavily? Or are you still looking, you still buying new stuff?
So what's interesting, I love the topic you chose today, getting started, right? Because I think getting started, usually people have enough money or save up enough money for one or maybe a couple, or in your case, you had a big liquidity event and you had a lot of your own money to deploy. But at
Right.
some point, people run out of their own money, whether it's at 4 doors, 8 doors, or in your case, 18 doors.
Right.
At some point, you have to start looking outside of the kind of save and invest strategy. And especially with 3 kids, our financial profile flipped upside down. We had 3 kids in 2.5 years. So
Oh
we went
man.
from dual income, no kids, to one income, 3 kids, one W-2 income, I should say. And then, started a couple side
Wait,
business.
did you say 3 kids in 2.5 years?
Yes.
And I'm doing the rough math, and that sounds back to back.
Well, we juiced our returns with the twins, right? So
Oh, okay. I see. That makes a lot. Okay, now makes a lot more sense.
yeah, so when you ask if we're doing some expansion, I guess you could say we're growing our family, but not as much acquisition on the rental front. We did one flip this year in 2024, and it was remote as well. We worked with a team in the Quad Cities area. Quad Cities straddles Iowa and Illinois. So this was the first property we bought in Illinois. We bought it in May and we exited last month in November. And so we did a flip this year. Our big project, which is pretty unrelated from single family, is my wife and I. So she wrapped up a contract after about 7 years in a nonprofit. And instead of going and finding another W-2 job full time, which would have been pretty tough on our family, we're going to start a business and build an assisted living home. We're calling it a memory care mansion. So it'll be a 10,000 square foot ground up development, 16 bedrooms, 16 bath. And this is different than a rental property. This is a full on business
Oh, for sure.
option, assisted living home, but it should more than replace any type of corporate income she was going to get. Plus it'll be backed by a very nice piece of real estate. So that's going to be our big, hairy, audacious goal heading into 2025. It's going to be probably a 3 to 5 year project when all is said and done. About 2 years of construction, 1 year of stabilization, and another couple years to run full cycle with the investors we're going to have to bring on. But
Okay.
so we're kind of concentrating a lot of our effort towards that project.
So you're doing
And
that like, I mean, from the ground up, like you're going to buy a lot, or do you already have the lot?
yeah, so we're narrowing in. We have a lot. We've talked to the seller's agent. We're getting very close on a 6.2 acre lot in Tomball, Texas, which is about 20 minutes from where we live here in a suburb of Houston.
That's intense, man. I mean, kudos. That's a huge thing to bite off. Like, especially jumping from, because you said everything else is single family, right?
Yeah, we did pretty boring, straight ahead, single family, long-term rentals, no fancy strategies. We did a few like live then rent. So we lived in a house for a year or more, and then we moved out and rented it. We bought a couple of them off market, but we never did any crazy, direct to seller. We didn't buy, heavy rehab properties. We didn't do any burrs. It was a lot of just saving and snowballing our own money and then operating long distance rental properties. So yeah, this is a whole new game that we're getting into now.
That's exciting though, man. I mean, that's also audacious. Like kudos on taking a big risk.
Yeah, I appreciate
That's
it.
intense.
Yeah, so obviously it deviates a little bit from the topic of getting started in real estate, but what I'll tie back to there is that, we would never have had the courage to take on something this big if we didn't get our feet wet and kind of learn some of the basic ropes of real estate. How does real estate work? What are some of the tax advantages? How do you think about portfolio management? How do you understand leverage and all the financial tools out there? Like, there's a ton of foundational skills from our, now 6 years as rental property investors that we're going to carry forward as we build out this, much more complex business. And
Yeah, I
so I
could
do,
not agree more.
yeah, so I do think
Yeah.
it's all related, and doing it while working a full-time job, learning all the different time management elements. That's what I'm passionate about. So I do coach new investors that want to get started, particularly focusing on people who live in high cost of living areas that can't afford to invest in their own market. And so, yeah, I teach them how to, build teams out of state, find the right markets, and set up all the systems that they need so they can run it on the side while working full time and having families. So this is a great tool for sure. Something I'm very
Yeah, yeah,
passionate
no,
about.
like, are you finding that to be lucrative?
Well, I mean, in the sense of like, there are definitely people that are willing to invest in coaching. It's it's a crowded field. Let's put it that way. There's like a bajillion buy your first rental courses, and
Right.
there are people that are a lot more famous and popular than me. So you're competing in a crowded field. With that said, the whole having three young kids, working full time, continue to advance in my career, and like building a business that doesn't take over your life, and kind of the contrarian viewpoint of most of the programs out there kind of position it says, how can I quit my job?
Right.
You know, silver bullet type situation. And I, believe that your job can be, and in most cases is, a very large asset in a portfolio of income streams that you can build over the course of your lifetime. So I do take a bit of a contrarian view there where like your W-2 is an asset that can help fuel your real estate investing, in your 20s, 30s, and 40s. And from there, it gets you all the optionality you could ever need for you and your family if you're building those in tandem. So to answer your question, we have over 60 members in the community we've built.
Yeah.
And, we do get a stream of people that are interested in kind of that philosophy of how to build it around your lifestyle instead of letting it take over your life.
That's fantastic, man. I think that'll also make this a really interesting conversation because you came at this from a very different place, I think, than I did. In that, like, it sounds like, well, you slowly built, you kind of slowly built up and you built it around kind of like doing like the standard 9 to 5. Where I was like, I'd been investing for a long time, and then I had this huge liquidity event that freed things up for me. But like that liquidity event was also that, okay, that was where I could stop doing the 9 to 5 thing.
It
And so
makes sense.
I came into real estate with like almost the opposite problem that most people have when they start it. So usually they'll save up some and kind of and then they'll like put that in play and then they'll just slowly expand. Where it was like I had more than enough liquidity to kind of buy whatever I needed to, but I was terrified of it. And so I feel like in a short period of time, learned a lot about I spent a lot of money learning what not to do. And so for
That
me, it was just kind of like I had like almost the opposite, not the opposite experience, but a very different kind of take on it. And that it was just like, man, if I had just started out like on my own and I don't know, like with 100K or something like that, I would have completely, there were a number of times when I was like, man, if I didn't have all this backing and I was still doing a 9 to 5 job, this would have train wrecked me. And almost always that turns into like a post on X or something where I'm like, whatever you do, don't do this. Or like, don't do this. It's the kiss of death. Like avoid this thing. That's usually because I said yes, or I agreed to it, or I tried it. And then just in doing it, just realized like, man, if I hadn't been so like I was never over leveraged, or I just, if I had like a mountain of debt, bearing down on me at that point, I would have freaked out.
Yeah. So are you saying that almost the liquidity event and the cushion and comfort that provided you put you in a different position where you made decisions in a different way than if you were still working? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Yeah. Especially early on when I didn't have a lot of scale, like it felt like I was screwing everything up. in retrospect, I wasn't, but it's just like I didn't even I wasn't dialed in at all in terms of like what things look like, how they work. Like early on, I would freak out about like every little tiny expense, even though I was well funded. But it was just like I think one of the places that we bought, I remember like the second month we had it rented, like I had to replace the garage door opener, and that destroyed like like all of the income for that month. And I'm like, man, this was just a loss. Like, is this not for me? Should I not be doing that? I just did, but at the same time, I had like, like that wasn't where, like all of our lifestyle income was coming from. So it was just sort of like a little like side project that I could play with. And as I did that, I just think I'm like, man, I would be probably, if this was just everything I had, I would be freaking out right now. And later on, you kind of realize it's okay and that it's fine. And just, it's just a capital intensive game. And so I feel like a lot of people get into it, or a lot of the folks that I talk to, like, they kind of get into it with this very starry-eyed, optimistic, like, oh, everything's going to be fine. They're like, wildly optimistic about the rents that they're going to get. They just assume it's going to be rented at least 90% of the time, just using these kind of standard formulas. And then they get into situations and they're just buried. Except it's
Yeah,
their livelihood on the line, not necessarily, they just because they don't have any buffer.
totally. So I think there's a few directions we could take coming off of that. That's those great nuggets, right? So we could go one of two paths. Let's have you pick. One is like, what are the steps to get started? And two, or what are the things not to do when you get started? I think we're kind of naturally going down path two already.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, I think let's not go down too far of that, because I did spend some time thinking about, okay, if I was just like a lot of what I'm doing now, I realized like if I just started this 20 to 25 years ago, I would be in such a different place right now if I just kept at it. But that's just with that like that long, and at any given point along the way, though, it just seemed like it's just so capital intensive to get into. So yeah, let's start with maybe the top, like let's say like top three or 3 to 5 things that to get started. And then we can get into like mistakes to avoid, like hacks, tips, tricks, like things to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you want me to go first or you want to
Yeah,
go?
yeah, go ahead.
All right. So I have kind of a 7-step framework, and I'll just read out the steps and a little
Sure.
bit of what each one is. And we'll see if it's similar to what you're thinking. But as with anything, any type of business or career objective, anything in the world, really, in life, starting with your why, right? It's a very cliche thing. You hear a lot of people talk about it, but to the point you were just making earlier, if you get into a situation and you're having to deal with some adversity, or your cash flow gets wiped out for a couple months because of a big expense, and you aren't strongly rooted in why you're doing this in the first place, you are very prone to giving up in most instances, right? But if
For
you could
sure.
zoom out and really understand the big picture and say, hey, I'm doing this to enable insert outcome here, whether it's, I want to have time freedom by the time I'm a certain age, or by the time my kids are a certain age, or maybe you want to accelerate your retirement by 10 years, like whatever that transformational outcome is that you're seeking, that you can really embed deeply into why you're doing it, it'll make those garage door openers and the big, water heaters, replacements that come out of nowhere or feel like they come out of nowhere. It'll make you be able to get through those type of moments. So that's step one. And I think that's an incredibly important step. Step two, identify your strategy, right? So I think some people get distracted right out of the gate because they get this idea of, I'm going to buy a rental property. And then they see somebody post on Facebook that they bought a mobile home park. And then they go spend, 2, 3 weeks or a couple months just like binging content on YouTube about mobile home parks. And then they see somebody doing a short-term rental, and then they go do that. And, next thing you know, I'm all for exploring and trying to understand what resonates with you. But if you don't actually pick something and get started and match it with that strategy and the why, then, it's going to be really hard to do anything tactical from there. Step three, pick your market and your submarket, whether you want to invest in your own backyard or whether you want to invest across the country or maybe even in a different country. Obviously, you got to, pick a geo, and there's a process for that. There's a lot of kind of macroeconomic analysis you can do. There's quantitative stuff you can pull, and there's qualitative observations you can make, even if you're not in that market. You gather that data, you interview different teammates, other investors, et cetera, and you make a decision about where you want to invest. Step four, build your real estate investing dream team. So, we have kind of what we call the core five, which is, you have your agent, you have your property manager, you have your lender, and you typically have some sort of contractor or maybe a handyman, depending on how intense the type of projects you do. And then the fifth one, which is kind of the special sauce, especially if you're doing remote, is the other investors in that market. And I'll share some stories maybe if we have time later on how we screwed up by not having that fifth member, the other investors. It kind of acts as a check and balance because, especially when you're remote, if you're just taking people's word for what they're doing and you don't have any type of system for oversight and like that checks and balances,
Yep.
it can be very, very difficult and you can be taken advantage of. I have learned that the hard way, which I take full accountability for. But now I'm very, very insistent on having that fifth member. Step 5, define your buy box and then use it to analyze deals every day for 90 days. So the idea here is that you build a very specific buy box and you take all that market analysis data, the areas that you chose to invest, you take some of the knowledge and expertise from your team, and you create what's the perfect deal look like for me. And you try and be as specific as possible. So maybe you're looking for a 3-bed, 2-bath, single story homes that are built, after 1985 and in these 3 zip codes. You can get as specific as you want, as long as it's still clear. And then the exercise we usually run people through is, now that you have your buy box, analyze every single deal that comes across in those parameters, at least one a day for 90 days. And if you run out of live deals, then either widen your parameters a little bit or go rerun some deals that have recently sold, just so you can get those reps in and really understand deal analysis. Promise I'm almost done with these 7 steps because I want your reaction to it. But
Sure.
step 6 is to make offers on everything that fits your criteria. So one of the biggest kind of fallacies that I think people come across, especially right now in this high rate environment and high price environment, is people run deal analysis based on the list price and they see that it's, a negative $400 a month cash flow and they just move on. They just accept
Right.
the list price as the gospel and they say, well, nothing works in this market, so screw it. I guess this isn't for me. Well, part of your job in analyzing deals in your buy box is to calculate what you can afford to offer. And then this is the biggest bottleneck, in my opinion, for most people, is that they don't actually make offers. They spend so much time hypothesizing and thinking and analyzing, and then they don't actually make any offers. And then they wonder why they don't get any deals. So this is where, like, as a coach, when I'm working with people, this is where I apply that gentle encouragement and pressure and say, okay, you've already defined what you're looking for. You've already built the team. You've already picked the market. You've already gotten good at deal analysis. If you can't come back to me in, a week or 2 weeks and have started making offers, then all this work is kind of for nothing, right? So that's one big point. And step 7 is build in your operational systems before you close. So that's whether or not you have a property manager. If you self-manage or if you use a property manager, what are your ongoing responsibilities and how you're going to kind of oversee that? And again, that's all in the lens of, in my case, I work full time. So this can't be something that takes 5 hours a week. It needs to be something that could be run not completely passively, because I don't think that exists, but at least something that can have some leverage on my time. So I'll stop there. That's kind of the 7-step process that I outlined based on my experience, but I'd love your reaction to any or all of that.
No, no, I think I agree. I was looking at like jotted out my kind of top 5 list in terms of just like net new, brand new investors, and I think there's a lot of crossover between mine and what you said. A lot of what you get into, I think, also dovetails into like I guess what I did kind of defined as like tips and tricks or like hacks or mistakes to avoid. But yeah, no, a lot of crossover there. In particular, like the number, especially when you're first starting out, like there's a lot of people I think that start following advice on YouTube. And there's a lot of really, I don't want to call it bad advice, but it's just not good advice for people that are starting out. And so, like when you talked about, like the number of times I've been in a conversation with somebody who, maybe like they have like I have a friend who has a single family rental, and that's all he's got. He's got one door. And going through what I've gone through over the last 3 years, I'm just like when I sit down and talk to him, I just really like, oh wow, like this guy really like he doesn't understand what he's doing. But he'll be like, yeah, I was thinking about buying a mobile home park. Or I was thinking about buying this like 16 unit property down. And you just realize like he has absolutely no business doing that. He has no idea how to kind of get into it. He'd probably just I don't know if he would like lose everything, but it would just cost him an insane amount of money. And that's, assuming he can even finance the thing initially. But people just get excited because they're watching these like shiny objects on social media. And they assume like, oh, that's the thing I can go mimic that. And it's just not a good way to do it. But yeah, probably agree with everything on the list. A lot of the things I would say, like on your list, for somebody that's starting out, I don't feel like there's any book you can go read or even any system that's going to like really prepare you for that first property and all the stuff that's going to happen. Like it's really difficult to preemptively go out and interview property management firms, have them take you seriously, and actually have some idea of like these people know what they're doing or don't. If you don't have some sense of what it's like to, if you haven't like managed your own property for a while or just dealt with a difficult property manager or something. So a lot of the time, like, you know, when you for your step with building the team, like I feel like people are kind of firing blind a lot of the time when they first start out. Like maybe they think they understand what a good property manager is, but if they've never dealt with one, if they haven't had to deal with the monthly statements, they haven't had to manage them through some difficult problems at a property, like they just have no idea. Or even more than that, you know, you can end up, it's easy to end up, I think, in a situation where like maybe your property's like got a bunch of problems, but they're just not being dealt with. You don't know that. The property manager doesn't know that. So from your perspective, you're like, hey, I get this money every month, everything's fine. But you don't find out until 3 years in that you've actually got a pretty awful property manager and they haven't taken care of things. You know what I mean?
100%, especially if you're remote. I mean, you're largely taking people's word for the work that they're doing, unless you have somebody on the ground or somebody, a trusted friend, or like I said, that other investor who can provide that check and balance and a little bit of oversight. Maybe they'll drive by your property, on an average winter day to see if it's over. I totally agree that, you're kind of just taking people's word for it. If you're, especially if you're remote, you got to install some sort of oversight or system to be able to understand if the work is actually getting done.
Right.
And if you're a newer investor, especially, I think property managers, unfortunately, some of them are willing to kind of take advantage of that naivety. And like, I think you said it earlier, people come in and a very rose colored glasses, like assuming everything will work out perfectly. And therefore they're like utterly unprepared to face adversity when it happens. Now, I say that not to scare anybody, but it's kind of a matter of like when, not if. Like things will happen.
Right.
And if you budget properly and you set your expectations properly, those things, nothing is going to stop those moments from sucking. Like they don't feel good when you have a big expense come across or you have to deal with an eviction or something like that. But if you're kind of building your business right and you're teaming up with the right people, then you can weather those things knowing that you've kind of planned for it. And there's always things that are unexpected. One of my favorite quotes, I heard it in The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel, but I believe the quote originated from somebody else, but risk is what's left when you think you've thought of everything. And so I think a lot of people, they've hit analysis paralysis because they're just trying to anticipate every possible downside scenario that could come up. And inevitably, when you do that, A, you don't take action, and B, it's the thing that you didn't think of that ends up happening.
Right.
So it's kind of like at some point you have to just get off the sideline and take some sort of action and trust that you will figure it out by leveraging the resources available through your network, through the internet, through the communities you're a part of. I mean, X is a great example now of, I've met some incredible investors that share openly about their experiences, both good and bad. And even by virtue of this space, right? Like we just spun this conversation up to share some of our perspective. There's stuff like this happening all the time.
Oh no,
And
it's huge. Yeah. It makes a huge difference.
yeah. And so, yeah, I totally agree with, that as kind of a risk. One thing though, to kind of put a better spin on it, right, is communities. I don't think you need to pay for, crazy expensive mentorships or communities and stuff to be successful. I don't think that at all. But I do believe that there are, I wouldn't even call them shortcuts, but when you do join a community, especially one that has some level of barrier to entry, like there's a ton of free communities that have great value, but you have to sift through a lot of noise. When you do join something like a paid community or a mentorship, typically the people that are in there are a bit more serious and committed. And so what I've noticed as a participant in several different communities is that I stopped making as many mistakes when I put myself in rooms around other people who are, at that 5+ rental. Like once I got past my first couple of deals, I wanted to be around people that had, 8 to 10. So I could see like, okay, what is the difference in the mindset of somebody buying their first rental versus somebody who's scaling and trying to do it responsibly? Because there is kind of a difference. I mean, you would know, especially with kind of how you outlined your story. You had two in the first year, and then by the third year, sorry, in 2023, you bought 12 doors total. And
That's right. Yeah.
the mindset and the operational challenges that come with scaling that quickly, I mean, you have to kind of change your identity as an investor in order to rise into that moment. So
Yeah.
point I
And
was
I
trying
think,
to make is just
no,
around
no, for sure. Yeah.
the
Like, well,
communities and stuff. So go ahead, sir.
I was going to say, yeah, to kind of like harp on the mindset thing, like, if you don't want to change, it's going to be really, really difficult. Like you mentioned, like, hey, outline why you want to do this and make sure that's there. And I would just say, like, the one thing that, like, it's like my first thing was just sort of like, make sure you're willing to, like, if you're not in a state where you're already, like, if you're not regularly spending less than you make and you don't have a lot of extra to like invest in whatever, whether it's real estate or not, it's like, definitely don't start. Like, first get yourself to that point just so that you can like prepare properly. And it's so that, it's not necessarily like you're not waiting on that rental income from like the first 3 months, just because like there's going to be so many different expenses and so many things that come up, right? So if you're not ready to
Always.
just actively adapt and learn constantly, because like those first two properties in particular, even for me, it's like I bought two single family homes when I started because that felt familiar. And then, as I got like at that point when I bought those, the idea of buying a duplex or anything more dense was terrifying. And then after I'd had those for about a year, though, suddenly, like, these other more dense properties didn't feel so scary. And like when I
Yeah.
bought that sixplex in the middle of 2024, that was a big kind of stretch for me. Just like going there and just seeing, you like, okay, there's these 6 units, they're all packed in here. It was just, it's just a simple 6 unit property, but at the time that was terrifying. Now that seems easy. But as you kind of go through that, like, to your point, like that, I definitely don't want to take my earlier comments as like saying like, don't pay attention to the social communities, these social communities, all these people you have online. There's a lot of really valuable stuff there, but I'm just, it's very easy to get distracted. And so it's like, you'd be skeptical constantly, I guess, is my advice on that.
Yeah, for sure. But also to the point you just made, right? That your vision evolved, your comfort level evolved as you, like, it happened organically, right? If the first property you bought was a sixplex, there's nothing saying that you couldn't be successful. But I would be willing to bet that you were more comfortable buying a sixplex after already owning, six other doors,
Oh,
right?
for sure. And I mean, yeah, like, I mean, with density, like one of my, like the tips or tricks that I had here is that if you're going to go more dense, just make sure you know what you're doing. Cause if you don't, all the mistakes that you make, just multiply that by the density.
Yeah, I'd rather make my mistakes when the stakes are a bit lower, and the ability to kind of recover and bounce back is easier when you have a smaller portfolio and you're still kind of learning. One thing I think you mentioned, right, that you started and you kind of only had the one, was it a friend or a family member that had the three rentals?
Yeah, it was a friend that had they had four rentals.
Yeah, so, my parents were investors and still are. They started investing in the early 2000s, and for the first 5 rentals that we bought, they were pretty much the only other investors we talked to, and they never heard of Bigger Pockets, they never were in any communities, they never hung out with any other investors. They did very well in their own right, they're very handy, they self-managed. I learned a ton from them, but I realized over time that by only exposing myself to that single perspective while I was building out the foundation with my wife, we were limiting ourselves and certainly like made some avoidable mistakes just by not leveraging the tools that are readily available on the internet, and of course you have to always take advice that you get on the internet with a grain of salt. But I do think that we kind of woke up to the idea that there is an abundance of information and perspective. And as long as you put that through the filter of what works in your own strategy, you can stand to gain a lot from hearing different perspectives. Like there were certain things we just didn't even consider. Like my parents, they only briefly used a property manager for the 25 years they've been investing. They've only briefly used a property manager for a couple of years. Otherwise, they defaulted to self-managing. So we defaulted to self-managing.
Yeah,
We, we
on that topic in particular, with that, yeah, I was just how, like, so when you started out self managing because of like their advice. It sounds like what you're saying,
well, less about their advice and more just like we didn't even really
or you just never
explore
even
or
considered it.
Yeah, we just never really assumed to do it. Now, our situation was a little different because when we started out, we were living in downtown Las Vegas and we bought our first rental a mile away from our house. So it felt like, hey, we can figure it out. It was newly reconstructed from the ground up. It was in good shape.
Yeah,
We found the
close,
first
easy
first
to
tenant
manage.
ourselves. Yeah, like I am not handy at all. I barely like hanging pictures on my wall. So it's not like I was over there fixing stuff, but it felt manageable because it was so close. So I think there was a comfort level that we established with the tenants and then we bought two more rentals in Vegas. And because they were local, for whatever reason, that made us feel more comfortable. I have come to challenge that assumption. I don't believe that that makes as big of a difference as people think,
Right.
whether it's, in your same city or not. But yeah, we self-manage. And then when we moved to Washington, it was in the middle of COVID. It was like June 2020. And bringing on a property manager, I don't know, it felt like we already had the relationships with our tenants. We already had the infrastructure, kind of enjoyed it, frankly, having direct relationships with the tenants, managing, like I knew how to manage all the lease and rent collection. And it felt like it wasn't the right time to turn that over. And then once we got up to Washington and we were able to run it for 5, 6 months without any major issues, we basically just continued to ride that train. Now we have just 2 months ago, we brought on a property manager in Las Vegas, but that was after 5.5 years of self-managing.
That's
And
impressive that you're able to do it that long remotely, because that's difficult. I think that's difficult to do. But I'm curious to see, like, especially you mentioned your parents kind of used them briefly and that it never sort of entered your mind. Like most of the folks that I've talked to that have like maybe just a handful of rentals, especially if they've ended up in a place where they're just managing them by on their own, like you and your wife were, they all have like a property management horror story where it's like they tried it at one point, like with one of their properties or two of them, and then just something went horribly wrong, and they're just like, all right, that's not for me. And then so they never tried again.
yeah, I've got one of those.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
I definitely have those. Just like one of the things that became clear to me kind of early on was if I wanted to expand, I needed to get really good at identifying an effective property manager, and that's not easy to do.
yeah, and so to the point of this conversation getting started in real estate, and you made a couple comments earlier that sometimes when you're new and you're interviewing a property manager, you don't necessarily know what to listen for in their responses. You might have a list of questions that you're going to read down and ask, right? You can download stuff from Bigger Pockets.
Right.
There's a bunch of different people that have those kind of interview checklists. But if you can't kind of sniff out or have a BS detector, sometimes you can get taken advantage of, right? I think that's the
Well, it's
mistake,
for sure.
which is that we kind of like we asked the right questions, but we heard what we wanted to hear instead of really like double clicking on certain things that maybe sounded like they weren't 100% what they should be. And we got ourselves in a bit of trouble in the first property we bought in Iowa because we interviewed the manager and they were telling us all the right stuff, but it turned out that they were basically just lying to our faces. And the TLDR version is we closed on that property in January in Iowa, which is the middle of a very cold winter. Turns out they never turned on the gas in the property. It was
Right.
sitting at 37 degrees for almost 7 weeks. And it also went without any showings. They said we could get, they promised us we could get $300 a month higher than what the comps backed up, but they were very insistent about it.
Right.
They're just salt on the wound. They weren't even doing showings. They just had a lockbox and there weren't any showings, but they were going to just let people in. And so
Oh,
yeah,
that's brutal. Yeah, you're describing like I think every like potential or like every new landlord's nightmare. Yeah, where
well,
they
and
just I mean, well, I think, like, it's something that people need to keep in mind when they're dealing with these property managers is it's a volume game for the property manager, and there's, like, a balance in there where it's like I mean, it's easy for them to like, they make more money the more volume they take on, so usually, like, they'll be whether it's, just like a one-person shop or, like it's rare for it to be like, if it's a really big professional operation, they're probably not willing to deal with a smaller with a smaller scale landlord that only has a couple of units. And so they spend most of their days though, they're dealing with a lot of volume, they have a lot of investors, and they've tuned in like how to deal with both in they're really good at dealing with tenants generally, but they're also really good at dealing with whatever drama comes out of their investor community. So when you go and sit down and talk to them, especially if you don't know any better, like there's 1,000 little things that are like flagging to them about who you are, what you know, what you don't know, and what they can take advantage of. And that unfortunately all comes into play. So they'll just like they can almost, with like for talking to you for a couple minutes, they know exactly what to say. They know exactly how to say it. They know how to kind of like perfectly put you at ease, and then you hand your property over and like suddenly you're just like, they're not answering calls, they're not taking care of problems. You find out that they maybe never listed it or didn't list it at the price that they said. So it can get really ugly if you don't figure out how to stay on top of it.
For sure. And I think that's where it's important to kind of understand like what the potential layers of oversight you can have, even if you hire a full stop property manager, right? Like it's perfectly appropriate for you to ask them and try and really get an understanding. What is their marketing plan to fill vacancies? What is their overall vacancy rate for the units that they manage? Like how do they treat tenants? What's their kind of standard operating procedures around response times? Like, what are their business hours? What happens in emergencies? And then
Right.
once you understand that, like really making sure that that's actually what's happening, right? And
Oh, for
giving kind
sure.
of a report back. One other point of view I developed over time was even if we have a full stop property manager, we want to have some direct contact, even if it's just introducing ourselves to the tenants. Because one situation we had was we had a property manager. We fired the one that I just described earlier, and we brought on another one at one point, and he was telling us that he was doing a bunch of stuff, and he wasn't. And our tenants figured out how to randomly. They tried to get in touch with my wife by sending her like 50 cents on Venmo with a big long message in the payment.
Oh, wow.
And because they didn't have a direct line of communication with us, and like it turns out that the property manager wasn't doing anything he was telling us. And then it became this game of he said, she said, and it spiraled kind of out of control. And obviously, again, that's kind of another property manager nightmare story because, and we ended up having to fire him too. But the fallout of kind of that neglect and mishandling of the tenant situation, it was a challenging tenant too. So like our trust was completely destroyed with that tenant, and it was a bumpy 6 months after that before she eventually moved out that we were self-managing it. And so now, we have a pretty firm stance that we're going to at least establish contact and say, hey, we are the owners of this property. Just wanted to reach out and introduce ourselves. We have X property management managing it. You're in great hands. We do want this to be a great environment for you to live in, and we care about keeping on top of things. So please make sure you escalate any maintenance related issues or things that come up. And then on the other side of that, because of course, when you give people an invitation to escalate anything, they certainly will, right? It'll start being anything and everything. But
Especially if they start trying to play you off of the property manager if they don't like what the property manager's doing, or they asked for something and the property manager said no or something like that.
yeah, exactly. So I think it's like establishing that kind of courteous relationship where it's like, hey, we may be far away, but like we're people too. We have kids, we have, jobs, like we understand kind of what it's like to be out in the world, and we do care about the quality of our homes and the quality of the living conditions that, we're providing you. So there's that empathetic connection, which is totally genuine, not just talking out of our ass, right? Something we care about, coupled with, really having good, strong communication with the property managers. Because I think if property managers know that you're not paying any attention, they will treat your property differently. The flip side of that, though, is that if you are a pain in their ass and you become a problem for a property manager, especially if you only have one or two properties, that can backfire on you too. So you got to really
Oh,
find that
no. Yeah, for sure.
Goldilocks spot.
Yeah, but I think like a big part of my life right now is managing property managers. And that's just like for me, I just treat them like employees and just assume that like I think there's a misconception too that just like the property manager is just going to handle everything and you're not going to have to worry about anything from your property. Like it's going to turn into like, like a CD or something for you where you just get a payment. Most of the time it's like they're not staying, really on top of like preventive maintenance. They're basically only doing the minimum. They're not doing regular inspections of the property, or maybe only when somebody moves in or out. But if you've got like a good property in a decent state, if you're not staying on top of them, there can be like months sometimes that go by before, between when they even stop by and take a look at it or just look at the building, do a walkthrough of it, walk around, just see what's going on. But
Yeah.
if you have also like a relationship with them and you stay on top of them and they understand that like you're engaged with the property, like you're not just completely offloading it to them. It's kind of like with a contractor, right? Like an unsupervised contractor will do unsupervised work. If they don't think you're going to check, they're going to get a very different, result than if they know you're going to show up and say something if there's a problem.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think one of the most dangerous words in the real estate investing world is the P word, passive,
Oh yeah.
because people, like you said, they just assume it's going to be some sort of monthly cash flow mailbox money printing machine. And, you can get it to pretty darn close to passive, but it requires some upfront work. That's why I said, in my little 7-step process, install operational systems before you close. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're self-managing. It just means, like you said, that you have a process to manage your managers. You have some sort of, bird's eye view of your portfolio and how it's performing. You stay on top of your books, or you have a service or software that does it for you. A
Yep.
lot of this stuff can be automated and really trimmed down to where it takes, you know, 10 to 15 minutes instead of hours. And, just about anybody can find a small chunk of time to take care of an asset that's worth potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars. And if you do that little bit of work and build it right up front, then it can be much closer to passive. But if you just assume from day one that's going to be passive and you don't do any of that upfront work, at some point that bill is going to come due, both
Oh, and it's gonna,
financially
yeah,
and emotionally.
and it's gonna be ugly. Well, it's also, I think, really like one of the things for me. I came from investing in stocks and bonds for decades, and so I've learned to look at real estate in kind of a months and years perspective. And that if I get hung up on what's happening in any given week or something like that, or actually maybe even months, maybe quarters and years is a better way to describe it. But it's like try to look at like, okay, how did this quarter go as opposed to like what's happening in any given month? Just because it's a lot of peaks and valleys, at least for me, where it feels like there's just a bunch of messes and it's taken a bunch of my time, or everything's just going smoothly. I don't have any trouble. I'll just like have like in month to month that can just flip, where it's just like all of a sudden for whatever reason, like the garage door springs on three, there's 3 or 4 garage door springs that for whatever reason all go out at the same time. And then at the same time, there's like some backyard issue, like the flooding or something like that. Or and then like in another one, like the toilet broke. It'll all just, but it like that'll always just happen at once. And if I get hung up on like, okay, like the returns for the month got shot because of that, and like I get really, really upset. But if I take a step back and just say, let me look at this over the course of a quarter or over the course of a year, it ends up it's a very, very different perspective and a very, very different kind of return. So anytime I get hung up or when I get into those like dark spots, that's kind of one of the things I just try to remind myself that like, okay, let me like take a step out, because every time I take a step out, like the returns are great and it's
Yeah,
a really good business.
my little catchphrase for that is, when in doubt, zoom out, right? If you really don't believe in the strategy, then you either probably, I mean, there's a number of different things that could be going wrong, right? Like you could have a leaky operational foundation, you could have bad teammates and all that stuff. Or you could be perhaps, like you said, just viewing it in too short term of a lens, when the real power of the strategy plays out over decades, right? A minimum years, right? Unless you're doing something more active like flips. But you're hitting on something that I also am very passionate about, which is when people refer to cash flow or they think about kind of their profits. A lot of people use the term cash flow and they're talking about the rent they collected minus the mortgage, and they're not really factoring in, accruals for basically the prevailing theory is that if there was no maintenance this month, then that's just pure profit. Well, there's stuff that comes due over time, right? And I think one of the biggest kind of rookie mistakes is to not budget properly for those. And I've actually seen like even some turnkey providers and companies they'll sell houses that have been recently remodeled by them, and they'll say, this has a cash on cash return of 8%, but they have a 0% accrual, a $0, line item for maintenance and capex. And they say, well, you don't need that because we just fixed everything. Everything's
Oh
fine.
yeah. And like, hey, we just remodeled it, right? So everything's perfect. Nothing, you're not going to have to repair anything.
Yeah, exactly. And so the way I think about cash flow is I always, at a minimum, first of all, I think anytime somebody presents a deal to you, always suggest underwriting it yourself with your own assumptions and your own figures and see if it shakes out the same. I have yet to encounter somebody who's pitched me a deal where, their numbers are more conservative than the ones I use. And so that 8% cash on cash that this turnkey company, says but they don't have any maintenance or CapEx budget. Once you add in some sort of budget for future expenses, all of a sudden that's a 3%, and it's no longer a big deal, right? So I think that's one of the things that I'm very, very adamant about instilling. And when I talk about cash flow, I'm always trying to do it net cash flow, because I do think that that's a dangerous, if you just bank all of that money and you go either spend it or take it as an owner draw, and then you have to replace a furnace, and then you're going back into your personal savings and contributing it back to your business to do that, that stings. But if you've been accruing it, kind of tracking the age of your mechanicals, you can't predict everything, but you certainly can. You can bank on father time taking its toll on your appliances.
Oh, for
That much
sure.
I know.
Yeah, my version of that like it's like two different principles for me is like one, don't be optimistic. Don't assume that you're going to be able to get just these really idealistic rents. Don't assume that things are just going to work. It's whether it's newly remodeled or not. Don't assume that you're not going to have problems. Don't assume that they're like whatever the expenses that you're calculating. Assume that they're going to be way higher. And then the second part of that is just verify everything, especially as part of a deal. Like the worst thing you can do is listen to what a realtor says and just say like, all right, well they told me it's an 8%, so I'm good, because usually the math that they're using is warped at best. It's just designed to display, like to put forward like the best possible lens on the property that they can, and without legally getting into some kind of trouble for lying. And
Yeah,
so like I've seen all sorts of, like they'll leave property management out of it. They'll assume that the maintenance is zero. Like even though they have bills for like all the like the utilities for the past year, they'll like cut that in half and say like, well, with these, if you change these spigots and change these other things, then those aren't going to be as high. And so like for me, I've just like anytime I go into a deal now, I just assume everything that I'm being told is probably not true. Like with the possible exception of like a rent roll, and that I need to verify everything. So if they, hey, like the realtor says, hey, the roof was replaced 3 years ago or 4 years ago, so no worries. Like first thing I do is call the roofer and get him out there and have him inspect that. I just check everything and assume that like it's just an industry where I feel like everybody's kind of incentivized to hide things.
yeah,
If they think that they can legally get away with it without getting into trouble, like they just won't say it. They won't tell you anything.
yeah. Their incentive, right, for more or less any real estate professional is to have a higher volume of transactions.
Right.
That's usually where most real estate professionals get paid. And then for a property manager, they're, I think actually I generally trust at least good property managers' opinions more, because they don't want to take on units that have problems.
Right.
And so I think anytime you can have a property manager walk a property that you're considering, you kind of, you collect all these perspectives. So you haven't, typically I don't waive inspections. I know that that's a way to make competitive offers, but especially if you're new, I don't think skipping an inspection makes a lot of sense. So you take an inspection, you have your agent, hopefully you have a good agent that you feel like you can trust. You get their perspective on what needs to be done. You get the property manager's perspective on, hey, what needs to happen to make this a compelling rental that's going to be durable and, last as long as possible. And you collect those different perspectives from people who have a different lens that they think of the property. And then, of course, you overlay that with your own perspective as an investor. And I think it's the collection of all of that that makes an informed decision, not just taking your agent's word for it, like you said earlier, because the agent, you have to always question the underlying incentive, even if you trust them. And there are also certain things that agents won't say, sometimes legally, like you said. There
Well, yeah, the requirements for the state, like, I mean, if you're dealing with like the best situation you can be in terms of an agent being honest is usually a single family home, because there's more scrutiny and legal requirement, like, especially in, say, a state like Washington, but even in Arizona, to just for that, like, if there's anything that you leave out, you can get in a lot of trouble. The minute you move beyond that into anything that's categorized as multifamily, though, the rules change quite a bit. And so they can be a lot more unscrupulous in terms of like, data information that whether they know it or not, like information that they leave out. Cause it's generally assumed that if it's anything other than, single family, that you have some idea what you're doing, you're more savvy, and that you're going to jump through all the hoops or you have some idea of all the hoops you need to jump through.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That's something that I learned recently, because I initially, especially the first couple duplexes that I bought, I was fortunate that they were newer, so I didn't get into trouble. But I found out later that they don't, even though like it's tagged like the disclosure requirement is still the same. it's nowhere near as enforced there. And so like if you report it to the Department of Licensing, they have a, like in Washington, they have just kind of like a, hey, like, well, you should have known better kind of reaction to it, as opposed to being willing to like dig in and really do something about it. But with single family homes, they'll absolutely like take somebody to the cleaners.
Yeah, no doubt. But with that said, I know we've kind of spent a good portion of this conversation talking about some of the things to look out for, kind of like protecting the downside. But like, what would you say are some of the key takeaways that can equip an investor who maybe doesn't have a strong foundational knowledge base to kind of show up in these conversations in a way that can protect themselves? So, like I was saying earlier, you can ask all the right questions, but if you don't know how to interpret the answers, it can be difficult. Like, what are some of the best ways someone can fortify themselves from that risk?
Definitely like reading and sorry, I've got my dogs barking here in the background. Hopefully that's not too annoying. Let me put my headset on.
I'll give my quick take on it while he's doing that. But I think the community, whether it's a free community, a paid community, coaches, mentors, and by the way, not all coaches are people that you necessarily have to pay. A lot of coaches and mentors put out content, right? So you can kind of get this proxy coaching just by being exposed to their ideas and hearing those perspectives. Like I was saying a bit earlier, if you over index and put all your weight on one or two people that are your friends, maybe they're real estate investors, but they might not have, that kind of diverse, broad perspective. That can be risky. But I think the more you expose yourself to different points of view and different levels of experience, that can arm you to spot BS when it pops up and just show up as a more credible investor. But I definitely want to hear your take too. I will try and kind of take us out here, but I think in essence, right, like that's one of the commonalities between both of our stories here is that we started very much kind of lone wolf, figuring things out as we went. We took imperfect action. That's something I feel strongly about. You can get caught in analysis paralysis very, very easily. And, finding the bottlenecks and kind of massaging your way down that. Like some people, they're great and they love spreadsheets and they'll spend all the time in the world analyzing a deal, but they'll never pick up the phone and, talk to their agent or make any offers. And so, it's pretty hard to get a deal done without making offers. And so I think that, taking action, making offers, getting feedback from the open market, understanding, talking to different property managers, agents, investors, et cetera, that's the best way to get started, in my opinion. It's not some perfect sequential list of tasks. It's just exposing yourself.
I think I pretty much agree with all of that. Yeah, like I would definitely read books, watch videos, like take whatever training you can or the time allows, but just also understand that there's really nothing that's going to substitute for getting just directly involved and starting to dig around in deals. And also, like I think one of the things that plagued me early on that took me a while to figure out was that it's going to take a lot of your time and that most of the deals aren't going to work out. Like initially it felt like I couldn't find anything that was going to, cash flow. And like, I would analyze, I don't know, 20, 30 properties and feel like I'd really put in a ton of work, like that was like a, meaningful amount. And then I realized later that it's like, okay, that number needs to be in the hundreds before I'm probably going to find something that I really, really like. And then even beyond that, like once you get involved in a deal, this kind of goes back to the don't be optimistic thing I was talking about before, but just at any given point, if things aren't lining up, just walk away. I feel like when people are like, especially if, you've got some cash together and you're getting ready to try and dive in and buy your first property, like any investor, I feel like is inherently optimistic. And they've got that kind of like, well, I'm going to do whatever, needs to be done here to make this work. And so as you're doing that, you dig in on a property, you start running into problems. You find out there's more issues than you realize. The prices may be too high. The rents aren't where you maybe thought they were. There's a lot more maintenance going on. And as that stuff stacks on, it's really easy to just try to be optimistic about it and say like, oh, well, I'll just figure that out. Okay, well, I can still make this work, as opposed to just saying like, hey, I'm willing to walk away. And that, that might mean, letting go of some money or letting go of things, but it's just like, you'll learn so much just through that process of like engaging on a deal and, digging in and like, calling the agents, finding out what's going on with the property, doing some basic analysis of it, trying to figure out if like using whatever formula you're using, whether or not it, it's going to meet your investing criteria, maybe getting that under contract, getting an inspection going. All of those things, as long as you're really digging in, are going to just teach you a ton about the overall process. But if you just get so fixated on like, okay, like you think like this property is just the one property and there's not going to be another one, it's really, really easy to make big mistakes and then actually like learn even less. So just getting in the habit of like, whether it's like talking to agents, going out and analyzing the properties yourself, maybe actually getting things under contract. Like for me, at this point, like this past year, I've probably like, my close rate is like maybe 1 in 10 versus like things that I'll put under contract just to kind of get my head wrapped around the property, get access to all the documents, see what's going on versus when I actually close. But early on, it felt like such a big deal and such a huge time commitment to just get something under contract that I was very scared. So just the sooner you can get over all of that stuff and realize that just, like the bigger players, they're all just constantly bouncing in and out of deals. Like they just don't care at all. Like they'll put something under contract, like a week later, they'll be like one little thing they don't like about it. And then they'll just pull out as part of due diligence. You know what I mean?
100%. And I think it's putting yourself in a room, whether that's literal or metaphorical, with people who are taking action and making offers, so that it doesn't feel so abnormal. If you're in a room with your high school friends who may be awesome people, but they have no interest in investing and they've never, they don't think about this stuff and they're not making offers, you're not going to probably gravitate towards that same behavior. But if you're in a room full of real estate investors or a free community or a group or whatever it may be, and everyone around you is analyzing deals and making offers, then you will probably be more likely to emulate that behavior. So I think, yeah, whatever it kind of takes to normalize the behavior that will lead to good, profitable deals and good operations, that's kind of how you can bolster yourself and give a toolkit.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
I do have
Yeah.
to wrap up now. I apologize, but I really enjoyed this, and I hope that we get to do it again soon, because I think we pulled on quite a few different topics that we can easily deep dive into on their own.
Yeah, for sure. I completely agree. Like, thanks so much for taking the time to do this, but also, yeah, like just to seeing the breadth of things that we covered. I'm like, man, on any one of these things, we could probably just dive in for at least like 30 to 60 minutes on just, but we touched like, probably 10 of those different topics. So I'll definitely, let's get another one of these set up.
We will do it. And thank you everyone who dialed in and listened.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for the time, Aaron. It was good to finally meet you. And thanks to all the other people for showing up.
Thank you too, man. Have a good weekend.
You too. Bye.
Thank you for making it to the end of today's episode. As you may know, podcasts are very difficult to grow organically. If you're getting value from today's episode, I'd deeply appreciate if you can take 30 seconds to leave my show a 5-star rating and review. This will go a long way to helping me reach more listeners just like you. Thank you so much in advance.